Lots of people want to get into reading classic literature, but don't necessarily know where to start. So here is a list of the best classic books that I personally recommend for people who want to read more classics. I'll give a brief overview of each of their themes and a little flavour of the plot, just so you'll know whether they are for you. And I do hope that by the end of this video, you'll be persuaded to get a copy of at least one of them. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. Okay, first up we have short stories, so these are all under 100 pages and are fantastic for getting started. Number 1 is White Nights by Dostoevsky. This book had a bit of a resurgence in 2024, and I think for very good reason. It's only about 50 pages long, and it manages to be both a straightforward love story and a critique of the entire ethos and genre of love stories. It follows a nameless protagonist over the course of 4 days in St. Petersburg, during the white nights of summer where the sun never quite properly sets. He slowly develops a friendship and eventually falls for a young woman named Nastenka, who is unfortunately in love with another man. In terms of theme, there is obviously romance, and I think that's part of what draws people in, but there's also an examination of the relationship between literature and reality. The narrator is sort of a dreamlike figure, and he views the entire world through the lens of the novels that he has read, and as a result, sort of casts the people around him as roles, as if reality itself is one great big story. White Nights was written before Dostoevsky went to prison, and in prison his entire outlook on life underwent a pretty radical transformation. And personally, White Nights is my favourite of his pre-imprisonment works. You can really see the tension between the writers who inspired Dostoevsky as a young man, many of whom were out-and-out romantics or magical realists, and the psychological bent that would inform his later work in the 1860s and beyond. It's also probably by far the easiest Dostoevsky book to read, so again, excellent for getting started. Next up we have The Wall by Jean-Paul Sartre. This story can quite literally be read in one sitting. It's about a group of resistance fighters being held captive in a basement by some nefarious authoritarian regime. And each of the characters exemplify slightly different approaches to their impending death. Some are pretty terrified, some focus mainly on how they will die and whether it will be painful, and others seem strangely at peace with it all. At the last minute, the protagonist of the story is offered a way out and must decide whether he is willing to be executed to maintain his beliefs and values. The thing that stuck out to me about this story and why I'm recommending it is just how amazingly human all the characters behave, even as they're put in this extraordinary situation and are told that they are about to die. They still manage to bicker and strike up temporary friendships and think about those they love and who they hope will love them in return. It reminded me of that C.S. Lewis quote about how humans are special because even facing our own death, we will discuss ideas and read poetry and comb our hair. It also has a great twist ending, which, again, I won't spoil here. But if you do find yourself trapped in a basement, you'll wish that you had some well-trained problem-solving skills, which is why I recommend you check out today's sponsor, Brilliant. We all know that studying STEM subjects like maths or science or programming can be incredibly tricky. These topics can get quite unintuitive rather quickly, and that often presents real difficulties. But this is where Brilliant can come in handy. Brilliant has added a huge number of topics this year, so you can learn anything from programming with functions to probability theory to learning the ins and outs of large language models or classical mechanics. Additionally, Brilliant's learning is all based around doing exercises and activities, so you can learn by putting the ideas that you're picking up into practice directly, which both improves retention and just stops things getting dull. Brilliant also personalizes your learning, which makes sure that you improve at a steady and reliable pace. If you want to improve your own critical thinking skills, then you might want to check out the logic courses on Brilliant, which will let you see what logic is about and just make the world that little bit clearer. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/unsolicited advice or scan the QR code on screen, or you can click the link in the description. Brilliant's also giving my viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, so please do check that out. But anyway, back to the video. Number 3 is Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. This is our first poem of the list, and it is less than a page long, but it's still considered one of the greatest English poems ever written. In fact, you know what? I'll just read it now, and then we have read at least one classic work in the course of this video. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. No thing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." In John Stewart's book on 19th century nihilism, this is one of the poems he looks at, and we've just gone through it. It is undeniably reflective of nihilistic themes of decay over time, and I would highly recommend looking into some of the secondary literature and analysis around this poem if you want to learn more about it. Next up, we have The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. One morning, as Gregor Samsa awoke from uneasy dreams, he discovered he had been transformed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. This is the iconic first line of Kafka's short story translated into English, which is about a man who has, as the line suggests, undergone a sudden metamorphosis into some kind of disgusting, spindly creature, usually depicted as a beetle, though this is not explicitly stated in the text. The story largely follows how Gregor himself and his family react to this rather unusual event. It can easily be read in an afternoon, and is also one of the less bewildering of Kafka's stories. Whereas something like The Trial, and especially The Castle, involve instantaneous scene changes and constant, dizzying, bizarre events, The Metamorphosis only really has one bizarre event, and the rest of the story is relatively naturalistic, or at least naturalistic by Kafka's standards. And this makes it great for getting into Kafka without becoming overwhelmed by his particular style. If I would give one pointer for going into The Metamorphosis, and this is something that really helped me get the most out of the story, it would be to try to view the book from every character's individual perspective and not just Gregor's. It's very easy to cast ourselves in the role of this ever-oppressed, bebeetled protagonist, but choosing to temporarily identify with the vindictive father, for example, gives us a bit more opportunity to use the text to examine our own cruelty, rather than simply use it to feed our own persecution complex, though that's always fun too. And finally, for this section, we have The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. You already know who Edgar Allan Poe is. He was even parodied in The Simpsons, which is how you really know you've hit the big leagues. The Telltale Heart is only a few pages long, so I can't say too much about it without just spoiling the entire thing. So I'll just say that it is a very short and readable murder mystery, and the perfect representation of what a really guilty conscience feels like, and leave it at that. Okay, these next few works are all either novellas or novella-length works, so between 100 and 200 pages. So still very much at the shorter end of classic books, but all of these are absolutely fantastic. And first up is The Fall by Albert Camus. Now, I know that The Stranger almost takes all the glory when it comes to Camus' fiction, but if I'm totally honest, I think his novels get better over time, and The Stranger is a pretty early work. But like The Stranger, The Fall follows a rather odd individual called Jean-Baptiste Clément, as he recounts his storied life to a stranger in a bar. He was once a popular, well-respected, and seemingly selfless lawyer, until a sudden failure to save someone's life completely derailed both his individual self-image and the way he perceives and approaches the world. From that point on, he found himself disenchanted with social life and the mountains of human hypocrisy that he discovered there. Most of all, he was disgusted with the hypocrisy that he found within his own heart, as his prior selfless deeds are revealed to be far more self-serving than they initially seemed. Unlike the protagonist of The Stranger, Meursault, who is quite unlike anyone I've ever met, Jean-Baptiste has this sense about him that, in another life, we could all have turned out a bit like him. He's an extension of some very human qualities, and whereas Meursault is great for contrasting with humanity as a whole, Jean-Baptiste is someone that many of us could plausibly become if we're not careful. He is a truly banal and everyday kind of malevolent, and I quite like that. Our next novella is A Hero of Our Time by Mikhail Lermontov. Lermontov is a criminally underrated and often quite shocking Russian poet who was so scandalous that the Tsar thought it was pretty good riddance when he died. If I'm honest, some of his poetry is quite difficult to read because I'm a bit squeamish and a lot of it's, shocking and a bit violent. But his most famous novel, A Hero of Our Time, is absolutely excellent. The hero in question is Pechorin, a highly competent and charismatic soldier serving in the Caucasus, whose main issue is that he seems basically unable to care about anyone other than himself. He somewhat values power and control for its own sake, but beyond that, he's sort of an unconscious egoist, or even an outright nihilist, depending on which passage you're reading. The book is formed of snippets from his life given out of order, which means it has the feel of a collection of tales about some twisted folk hero, which is obviously very appropriate to the title. It's some matter of debate what relationship to the character of Pechorin Lermontov himself had. Was he faintly admiring? Was he outright condemnatory? Or was he somewhere in the middle? The mixture of Lermontov dying quite young and the ever-looming presence of the Tsar's censors means that it's difficult to be exactly sure what Lermontov's intentions were here, though the sources that we do have suggest that he had a complex attitude towards the character. Personally, I read the novel as an exploration both of the undeniable allure of power and the dangers of pursuing it at the expense of any interpersonal companionship, but that's just one angle on things. It also has some lovely descriptions of mountains, if that's your thing, and it certainly is mine, so that's another thing I enjoyed about this one. Next up, we have War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. This is the original Alien Invasion book, and it's honestly very, very good. The premise is that a hyper-advanced Martian civilization has invaded Earth and is conquering large swathes of England. Our protagonist is pretty unconventional in that he is almost totally ineffectual and largely just watches the chaos unfold and does his best to try to escape it. It's a pretty bleak novel, and there is very little heroic fighting back against the invaders, but it's also, at least in my opinion, much more psychologically honest than a lot of modern depictions of a hyper-civilizational threat. There's no heroic underdogging your way out of such a hopeless situation, and the attitude of our protagonist reflects that. It is a bit longer than the other novellas here, but I would still loosely place it in this category. It just has a bit more of a novella feel about it. I can't really justify it any more than that. Next up, we have Othello by William Shakespeare. Shakespeare is really quite difficult to read at first, but I think Othello is one of his more accessible plays. It is a very compelling experience, even without understanding all of the little references in early modern English that get lost on contemporary ears, including my ears, as much as I wish they didn't. The play follows the titular Othello, a Moorish general in the Venetian army who has just married Desdemona, a young Venetian noblewoman. However, the character we see more than anyone is the villainous Iago, Othello's former friend who, unbeknownst to him, is plotting his downfall and plans to twist Othello's mind against him and inspire jealousy within Othello and Desdemona's relationship. The plot is genuinely thrilling. It has some of Shakespeare's best lines in it, it is shorter than Hamlet, and Iago is possibly the greatest villain in all fiction. It's still one of the best pieces of literature on the subject of jealousy ever written, in my opinion. I am sort of biased here because Othello is my favourite Shakespeare play, but even taking that into account, most people agree it is one of the better ones, and it will help you find out if Shakespeare is your thing. As I said, it is very enjoyable even not understanding all of the little early modern English terms. But if you can, do try and get a study copy of the play, because oftentimes either underneath the script or just on the other page across from the script, it will explain some of the unfamiliar terms, and that can make reading it a little bit easier and a little bit more smooth, I suppose. Also, do try and see it performed if you can, because it was made to be presented on stage, and that I still think is the most enjoyable way to experience Othello. Now we have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is another of those books where the core premise has seeped into public consciousness an awful lot, but the story itself is both more sophisticated than our general understanding of it, and it is definitely well worth reading in its own right, even if you're pretty sure that you already know what it's about. Dorian Gray is, to quote Zoolander, really, 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 really ridiculously good-looking. So much so that almost anyone he meets either falls for him or develops some kind of repressed homoerotic fascination with him. And this gives him power, which he abuses to no end. The book manages to do a lot of things. In one sense, it's kind of a morality tale, but it doesn't beat you over the head with its message. It explores romantic obsession as well as non-romantic obsession, and a kind of obsession that floats in an ambiguous area between romantic and non-romantic obsession. It has an awful lot to say about beauty, as you might expect, as well as the consequences of egoism. And it does all of this without just demonizing the character of Dorian and being done with it. So yes, I highly recommend it, even if you already think you know it. Next, we have Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck is brilliant, but he does write quite difficult books. East of Eden is really quite challenging, and while I absolutely love The Grapes of Wrath, it just isn't the easiest book to jump right into. But Of Mice and Men is, in many ways, just as worth reading as these larger tomes, but is, on the whole, a lot more accessible. It's set during the Great Depression and follows two itinerant workers, George and Lenny. Lenny has a mental disability, but is physically incredibly powerful, making him a very kind, but sometimes unintentionally dangerous, gentle giant. Steinbeck has a real gift for getting you really, really attached to his characters, and then using that attachment to wring out your emotions in an absolutely brutal fashion. And that definitely comes across in Of Mice and Men. It's around 100 pages long, it is incredibly readable, and it never fails to make me basically just sob. Okay, our next category is funny classics. I think there is this general idea that classic books are meant to be serious and somber, but a lot of them are quite fun. And I do think that it's worth checking those out if, like me, you enjoy a more comedic book sometimes. And first up, we have The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. I feel like the premise alone is enough to sell you on this book. In the manner of The Devil Goes Down to Georgia, the devil goes down to Moscow and starts to cause havoc in the theatrical scene. The novel is split into two parts, and the parts are pretty different. The first is much more farcical and includes a healthy dollop of social commentary on Stalin-era Russia and all the ways that the populace fell short of their supposed ideals. The second half is a little bit more earnest, though still has funny moments, and it follows a quest for forbidden love between a failed novelist and a married woman, in which Satan also has a very major role to play. Bulgakov is sometimes compared to Kafka, and I think that that's a pretty fair assessment. This is quite an absurdist work, and it has the same mixture of sincerity and comedy about it. But it is also a lot more grounded than many of Kafka's stories. It involves supernatural elements, but the supernatural elements come from familiar folklore. It's also just quite funny, and Bulgakov is great at building suspense, so it is a real page-turner. It is a classic book that has made me laugh out loud, and I feel like that's as high praise as I can give it. Next up is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard. Tom Stoppard sadly passed away a few days before I'm writing this. He is one of my personal heroes and my favourite modern playwright. And Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead is one of his funniest and most philosophically astute plays. As the name would suggest, it follows the two characters from Shakespeare's Hamlet, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who have a vague awareness that they are destined to die later on in the play, but get up to a lot of mischief in the meantime. It's difficult to talk about this play because so much of its brilliance is in how Stoppard uses language and wordplay for humorous and philosophical purposes. If you can see it performed well, then please do. And if you can't, then the script itself is a great read, especially if you enjoy very linguistic humor. And as a play, it's also a relatively brief read and, doesn't mince its words very much. Stoppard is fantastic for his economical and incredibly witty style of writing. So, yes, if you can go see it in person, then please do. And if you can't, then I would highly recommend reading it. And finally, for this section, we have The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg. I was in two minds about including this book on the list because, full disclosure, I'm only about a third of the way through it. But it is also one of the best dark comedies I've read in ages, And I also think that although it is a classic, it often flies under the radar in lists like these, so I just wanted to mention it. The broad premise is that it follows a murderer who believes that he can commit any crime he wants because of his rather confused religious upbringing that left him thinking that he was one of God's elect, and as a result, no matter what he did, he would definitely go to heaven. That's why it's called the Confessions of a Justified Sinner. It's about justification. The comedy in this book is mainly due to the characters. A lot of them are really larger than life, and at points the book veers into slapstick, at least as far as I've read. But I am really enjoying it, and I have spoken to a friend who's read the whole thing, and she said that the rest of it is just as funny and just as dark. It's a bit like 19th century edgy humour, but if you are partial to macabre comedies, I really think you'll enjoy it. Okay, our next category is ancient classics. Books from, around 2,000 years ago are famously quite hard to get into because of the amount of cultural distance, but here is what I would recommend getting started. First up, we have Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. This is the most famous iteration of the myth that spawned 1,000 your mum jokes and one Austrian psychiatrist. You will have almost certainly come across the plot in its entirety, or almost its entirety, so I won't worry about spoilers. Essentially, unbeknownst to himself, Oedipus has managed to kill his own father and marry his own mother. Obviously, he didn't realise they were his mum and dad at the time, since he was adopted. But either way, he eventually finds this out because a plague begins to ravage the city he rules over, Thebes, and this was sent as punishment from the gods for a grand impiety, and Oedipus wants to get to the bottom of it. He discovers his own secret, which is the grand impiety that's causing the plague, and gouges his own eyes out in shame in a scene that's reported by a messenger, but is just sort of terribly visceral in a sort of suggestive sense. That's sort of a contradiction in terms, but when you read it, you will understand what I mean. There are a number of excellent reasons to read this book if you're trying to get into ancient literature. First, it's a play, which means that it is shorter than most novels. Second, you'll probably know the broad contours of the story, so you'll already have a broad structure to guide you. Third, it's almost the model example of a Greek tragedy, and so you'll be introduced to pretty much every aspect of the genre. And finally, it gives you a sense of how the Greeks perceived shame or guilt, which is really different to how we conceptualize it, and that is fascinating. It's also just very well written and well paced. Good old Sophocles. Next up, we have
The Aeneid, Book 4 by Virgil.
Okay, the Aeneid itself, even in a really good translation, is just pretty heavy going.
But I just want to recommend a single book out of the 12 books of the Aeneid, and that is Book 4.
This is the tragedy of Dido and Aeneas. Aeneas is the great hero of Troy that will go on to found the precursor to what will be Rome, and Dido is the queen of Carthage. You might recognize Rome and Carthage as, historically speaking, not overly fond of one another. They had an on and off rivalry that culminated in Rome burning the North African city to the ground, and this is sort of the mythological story given to explain why they were at each other's throats so very much. Without going into details, the relationship doesn't end on good terms. I'm realizing as I write this out that most of the love stories in classic books just end in disaster. Maybe we just don't make lovely, gooey, happy endings into classics, with the exception of Jane Austen, who we will come on to later. Either way, this will allow you to find out if ancient epic poetry is really your thing. If you find it totally off-putting, then you'll probably find a lot of other ancient epics quite off-putting as well. But if this leaves you wanting more, then the whole rest of the Aeneid is waiting for you, and it is excellent, although it's been a while since I've read it in its entirety. Next up, we have The Amores by Ovid. This is ancient Roman dating advice from my personal favourite classical poet. The book opens with a joke about how Ovid wanted to write something serious and epic and about war and heroes, but he got too distracted and ended up writing about love instead. As you might expect from a poet, this is a long poem in 3 parts. But again, try not to think about it in terms of serious poetry. Try to think of it in terms of one long piece of comedic writing, or even maybe like a comedy song. Though I should say, its light and entertaining tone doesn't mean that it is devoid of insight. Ovid's poem is still a pretty perceptive set of observations about love and lovers, including all of the foolish and silly things we do in the name of love. Almost all of Ovid's poetry, or at least his poetry that I've read, shows a really nice mix of acknowledging how silly people are in the throes of passion, but also not condemning them for this, instead just sort of poking fun at them like a good friend would. And I like that. Some of the advice he gives is pretty questionable, but it's never boring. And finally, we have The Satyricon by Petronius, and I've added a not safe for work disclaimer here. When we think of the great city of Rome, who are the names that come to mind? Julius Caesar? Augustus? Marcus Aurelius? Virgil? We don't tend to think of ancient sex comedies about young men getting into embarrassing situations while being horrendously drunk. I actually can't say too much about the Satyricon without getting this video demonetized, as it is a truly vulgar comedy, but I wanted to include it and mention its name for two reasons. The first is that Rome had a real tradition of biting satire, and this is one of the most extreme examples of that. And the second is that it's good at banishing any illusions you might have that Rome was all marble statues and grand speeches and glorious campaigns. They had those as well, but they also had the ancient equivalent of the Hangover movies, and there's something that's just so wonderfully life-affirming about that. In that way, this pairs quite nicely with Ovid's Amores, though it is a lot more explicit. It's sort of, I don't know, as I say, not safe for work, but it is well worth a read. Cautiously, obviously, if you're an adult and everything. Our next section is big readable names. So you will have almost certainly have heard of these books, but I want to convince you that they are far more readable, accessible, and tackleable than you've been led to believe. First up is Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And I don't think this needs too much of an introduction. You may already know this, but for context, Crime and Punishment is about a young man named Raskolnikov who murders a pawnbroker, and it's about how he psychologically reacts to that. What I really want to get across here is that Crime and Punishment is just as good as people say, if not better. Since it has such a reputation as a canonical text, people often downplay that it's actually just very gripping to read, even if you're not trying to, comb it for philosophical insight. Dostoevsky is generally more known for his character work than his plots, but Crime and Punishment's story is both pretty fast-paced and very naturally holds your attention. So in some ways, it's the best of both worlds. It has all of the philosophical depth worthy of the title of classic, but because Dostoevsky wants to get across Raskolnikov's spiraling mental state, its plot sometimes feels like it's moving as quickly as, a modern thriller. So if you haven't read many classics before, please don't be put off from this being your first big, weighty classic book. It will probably be far easier and far more naturally compelling than you think. Next up, we have The Red and the Black by Stendhal. I feel like recently I've been banging on about Stendhal all the time, so I'll make this relatively brief. The Red and the Black follows Julien Sorel, an ambitious but low-born social climber, as he has two passionate love affairs. If you're a fan of Jane Austen, this is a little bit like if someone added a healthy dollop of cynicism to a classic Jane Austen novel. Stendhal is fantastic at analysing love in a way that doesn't deny all its uglier aspects, but also doesn't shy away from the good or exciting parts either. And that's what I like about this novel. It's also a great classic even if you haven't read many classic books before, because the chapters are quite short, and it's also split into two parts, and the parts are quite isolated from one another until the end. I've said before that you could probably read the first half of The Red and the Black as its own book, and I basically stand by that assessment. So if the whole book seems a little bit too much, then just read the first half and you'll come away very satisfied. This was also one of my top books of 2025, and I would highly recommend it if you are a fan of books based around complex social dynamics as well as love. There's a class element, there's a romance element, and Stendhal is just a penetrating, psychologically astute author. So you're just bound to learn something about yourself and about the people around you, even if it's not necessarily a pleasant thing, but that's valuable in its own way. Next up, we have The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. I've always had a deep-set fear of wasting my life, of drawing my final breath full of mucus and regrets. Evidently, Tolstoy had that same fear, because The Death of Ivan Ilyich is all about a guy who does just that. Ivan Ilyich is a man who makes all of his decisions and lives his life according to custom and social pressure. It's not that he's a coward or anything like that. He just never really bothers to think outside of the constraints that are handed down to him from his elders and his social betters. He marries the woman that he's supposed to marry, has kids just as is expected of him, and has a moderately successful career doing something dull but remunerating. On the whole, by any objective standard, he lives a pretty decent life. But all of this changes as death approaches. Ivan Ilyich falls ill, and all of a sudden, the sheer magnitude of his mistakes dawn on him. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that he dies, considering it's in the title. And it's very easy to listen to my description and say, oh yeah, I get it. Don't waste your life. I don't need to read over 100 pages about that. But I think that that would be a mistake. Tolstoy is absolutely excellent at getting across how each of Ivan Ilyich's individual decisions make perfect sense at the time. No one could object to them, and indeed, no one does. They were sensible and they were sound. But together, they add up to a wasted existence. This book has given me more than a few sleepless nights, and I think that's probably what Tolstoy was going for. So if you want to have some sleepless nights as well, then please do pick it up. Right, next up we have Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. This is possibly the most famous book about adultery ever written, with maybe the single exception of Anna Karenina, and I think people often do focus on that scandalous aspect of it. But at least as important as the adultery itself is why Emma Bovary embarks on her ill-fated trysts. The first part of the novel, among other things, outlines her education and background, and the strange and outsized expectations that she has learnt to place on marriage and relationships formed by romance novels. It is a pretty tragic story, but unlike some of the other romances on our list, Madame Bovary just has an outright self-destructive protagonist, and I love that. I think it's really ballsy, and it makes it very compelling to read. Flaubert is a fantastic psychological writer, and the whole plot has this slow, creeping sense of dread as you are made aware of the depths of Emma's mistakes, even as she remains willfully ignorant of them. It's not a fast-paced novel, but it is really compelling, and I think it can genuinely give us an insight into the phenomenon of infidelity. Okay, here we have The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Goethe. This novel actually caused a bit of a stir when it was first released, as it spawned the Werther effect, where readers of the novella would attempt to follow the protagonist into the grave. At its core, it is a tragic and unsettling love story about a young man named Werther and the object of his affections, Charlotte. And as the title suggests, it doesn't go well. In many ways, this book is the definitive story of tragic romantic passion, both in the sense that it follows a romantic obsession in the everyday sense, but also because it was a huge influence on later writers within the tradition of Romanticism. I can't really say much more about it without spoiling it completely, but if you want a full analysis, friend of the channel, Keegan Kjeldsen, has recently put out a video on the novella over on his channel, Essential Salts, and I highly encourage you to watch that. But of course, do read the book for yourself as well. Next up we have The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I know that many of my American viewers will have been forced to read this at school at one point or another, but it's not that widely read in the UK. So for those of you who haven't given it a go, I would highly recommend it. The book largely focuses on a cast of 5 core characters. There's Nick Carraway, the narrator, Jay Gatsby, Tom and Daisy Buchanan, and Jordan Baker, as they navigate the less glitzy aspects of the so-called Roaring Twenties. I'm currently writing a full analysis of The Great Gatsby that I hope will be out before Christmas. I honestly do think it's one of the best explorations of hope, desire, and failure that I've ever read. If you have read it at school, then I really do encourage you to read it again with adult eyes, and if you haven't, then please do pick it up. It is quite modest in length, my copy's around 160 pages, and the style of writing is very approachable. If you've not read a classic in a while, or ever, then it will probably stretch you just a little, but it'll be a pleasant stretch rather than being 6 twists into a session on the torture rack. Next we have The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. For a book that is so influential, I actually quite rarely come across people who have read Jekyll and Hyde. This is, in my opinion, a massive shame because it's actually one of the most pleasant to read classic books out there. Reading it in the modern day is a bit different because it was originally framed as a mystery with a twist. We're meant to be thinking as we read the novel, who is this mysterious Mr. Hyde? But because now almost everyone does know the twist in advance, you probably won't be reading it in the same way that someone in the 19th century would, but it is still very much worth reading. Although, spoiler alert, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person, the novel takes this in a very different direction to our modern understanding of the term Jekyll and Hyde. We tend to use it to refer to things like a split personality, or someone who acts very differently from one situation to the other, such that they seem to have a split personality. But the novel is much more ambiguous, and Hyde is presented as more of an alternate identity that Jekyll consciously inhabits in order to get up to no good without facing any kind of consequences, rather than an entirely separate person who he is sharing his body with. I actually think this is a much more interesting premise, as it genuinely raises interesting philosophical questions about what morality looks like without any kind of accountability. Jekyll and Hyde is actually a pretty good way to ask yourself how you would act in this situation where you have a magic potion that basically just divests you from any kind of consequences for your actions when you are in this other state. Okay, next we have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And like many on this list, you'll probably already know a lot about this book because its adaptations are so very famous. I know it's a bit cliché, but I really do promise that the book is almost certainly better than these adaptations. For one thing, the monster is far from being a sort of mindless zombie-like character. In fact, the monster is incredibly intelligent, deeply poetic, and quite compellingly troubled. And he has to deal with the fallout of being abandoned by his creator, Victor Frankenstein, who's a very, very intelligent young genius who resurrects this amalgam of different dead bodies that he's taken from executed criminals in kind of a sequence that's far more macabre than anything that's often shown on screen. Shelley is probably a bit more difficult to read than some of the others on this list, just in terms of writing style. But Frankenstein explores so many themes that are just deliciously prescient. Today, it can be very easily read as a reflection of the relationship between mankind and technology, since Shelley was writing at a time of monumental scientific and technological advancement, very much comparable to our own dizzyingly technological age, especially with the prospect of potentially artificial consciousness looming as a possibility in the next few decades. A story about someone abandoning their own vulnerable conscious creation is probably worth reading. It seems to me that that's going to be a pretty important philosophical question going forwards. Next, we have 1984 by George Orwell. Like a lot of the books on this list, 1984 has sort of been soundbiteified over the years, to the point where it is definitely worth revisiting the core text itself to remind us of what Orwell actually said, because it's often a lot more nuanced and a lot more fascinating than what ends up at the end of this game of telephone, whereby, what's actually in the book gets translated through adaptation and then through someone half remembering that adaptation until you kind of end up with this very simplified image of the text itself. For instance, while the totalitarian state and the concept of Big Brother are really famous, and you'll probably already be quite familiar with them, Orwell also has a whole nuanced critique of how authoritarian regimes abuse psychological research and psychological tools to suppress people's individuality and leverage a whole apparatus of medical authority or pseudo-medical authority for their own power. This is an incredibly interesting point, and it's something that you'd probably miss without reading the novel for yourself. Orwell is known for being clear and concise, but his books tend to contain very weighty themes, and I think this makes him ideal as a first classic to read. I've picked 1984 for this list, partly because I really like it, and partly because it's quite well known, but this goes for pretty much all of Orwell's fiction. Although it's been a while since I read it, and I suppose it's not strictly fiction, even though it's fiction-esque in tone just because of how descriptive it is and how Orwell writes it, I remember really enjoying an homage to Catalonia, and I would highly recommend that if you like 1984 and you like Orwell, it's a very different subject matter, but it is fantastic, and I would definitely recommend reading it. It's based on his experiences during the Spanish Civil War, which really did shape him as a person. So if you do want to get kind of inside Orwell's head, getting to know an homage to Catalonia really is essential. And as a bonus, it's an absolute pleasure to read. And finally, we have Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I've mentioned Austen a couple of times in the video so far, And this list would definitely be incomplete without including one of her books. You've probably already heard of Pride and Prejudice and may have watched one of the film adaptations, which are genuinely pretty good. But there really is no beating the book itself. Austen is a really entertaining writer, and once you get out of the headspace of thinking of it as a classic romance novel and start thinking about it as the 19th century equivalent of a really well-written rom-com with touches of drama, it's much easier to enjoy just how witty Austen's writing is. I don't know whether this will help you, but my internal voice for the narrator is sort of an overly posh, elderly British woman a la Judi Dench. And I found that got the humour across pretty well for my, internal listening, if that makes sense. Your mileage may vary, but do try it out. If you're a fan of romances more generally, then you'll probably really like Pride and Prejudice, but it's also just great if you want something witty and relaxing to read. It's not that cognitively taxing, but it's still absolutely fantastic. Right, our next section is about long reads that are still very much approachable and very much worth reading despite their brick-like appearance. I feel like a lot of people are intimidated by the length of these books, but honestly, they are not nearly as difficult as they seem when they're just kind of sitting on your desk like this enormous genius paperweight. And first up is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. I know this is a long book, and as a result, it can seem pretty intimidating, but Anna Karenina is a lot more entertaining and a lot more readable than you might first expect. The same goes for War and Peace, as it happens. These are both books where lots of things occur, and they are best read slowly in small chunks, but they are genuinely very entertaining. The other thing that will make Anna Karenina easier will be to have a list of the main characters' names to hand so that you can check them if you're confused by one of the many different forms of Russian name that come up, as well as nicknames and diminutives and all sorts. I'm personally recommending Anna Karenina rather than War and Peace here because there are a lot fewer characters to keep track of, and that makes it a bit easier to follow. It's also, in my opinion, the more cohesive of the two. War and Peace is an epic and has tens of stories contained within it, whereas Anna Karenina, at least for the most part, keeps itself to itself and largely has fewer, I would argue, slightly more developed stories. It's my favourite of the two, but it still has an awful lot to say about friendship, love, embarrassment, nature, loyalty, morality, lust, and social forces. It just says it in a tighter package. Next up, we have The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. The Brothers Karamazov has a real reputation for being unapproachable, but I would respectfully disagree with this assessment. I just think it needs to be approached with a slightly different attitude to a lot of books. It's not structured as a neat journey from point A to point B, and it likes to take its time to meander along the way, exploring all the different cracks and avenues of the various characters, ideas, and philosophies. I probably wouldn't recommend this as the very first classic you read, and I tend to say that it's a pretty good one to read after something like the more plot-focused Crime and Punishment, but it's my favourite book for a reason. My main advice when approaching The Brothers Karamazov is to focus on the characters themselves. The main event the whole book is structured around doesn't happen until past page 400, which can be really frustrating if you're trying to race through it and find out what's going to happen next. But if instead you approach it as just wanting to learn more about these characters and wanting to spend more time with them, then the book suddenly becomes incredibly enjoyable. And the fact that the plot isn't as fast-paced as in a lot of other books stops becoming a con and starts really being a pro. And last up, we have Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. I found out the other day that this is apparently like the second most read novel of all time, which completely shocked me because I haven't come across a lot of people, at least in England, who've read this book cover to cover. It's actually been a very long time since I read it myself, but I think it is an excellent long classic for a beginner for one key reason. It is quite funny, and it satirizes a lot of tropes in fiction that do still exist today, albeit in altered forms. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote in part to satirize chivalric romances, which were a form of fiction that had been popular in Spain, at least in the recent past, for Cervantes. Quixote goes mad, essentially, and attempts to become a questing knight, with predictably funny results. We are not as steeped in the world of chivalric romance today, but we still have lots of tropes that are similar to the ones from that genre, like a noble hero embarking on an epic quest in service of a noble lady. So a lot of the satirical elements hit quite nicely. A friend of mine also recently reminded me that the novel also has some really interesting self-referential humor in the second half that comes across as strangely modern. As I said, it's been a while since I read this one, so my memory of it is pretty hazy in parts, but I do really remember loving it, and at the time that I did read it, I hadn't read many classics, so I feel very confident recommending it as a readable, if quite long, classic book. And that's it. Those are 31 classic books that I'm very confident that you will read and enjoy, even if classics aren't normally your thing. And if they are, then you'll definitely enjoy them. I also did one of these videos for philosophy books a while back, so if you want to check that one out, it is right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.